Hello, I'm National Park Service Ranger Ernie Price, standing in front of a large two-story framed wooden farm home that is white. It was built in the mid-1850s and lived in by Oliver Perry and his family at the beginning of the American Civil War. But today, the White House, as it's locally known, is the only historic structure from that period that exists in what is now known as Camp Nelson National Monument. Now, if you haven't heard of Camp Nelson National Monument or don't know too much about it, don't feel too bad. We're actually a pretty new unit in the National Park Service. One of course, many Civil War parks and a string of Civil War sites managed by the National Park Service. Camp Nelson, though, is not a battlefield. Instead, it was a supply depot that was established here in 1863 in central Kentucky, about 20 miles south of Lexington. But as the war would go on in 1864, Camp Nelson would become a recruiting and training site for more than 10,000 formerly enslaved men who would become what was known then as United States Colored Troops. Now, Camp Nelson, like all units of the National Park Service, has an amazing contribution to the American tapestry, important stories that allow us to understand our nation on an even deeper level. But today, we invite you to take a journey with us, along with our friends and colleagues at multiple National Park Service sites, for the purposes of tracing the steps of two of the USCT units that formed at Camp Nelson, the 114th and the 116th USCT. Two units that in their very own right contributed mightily to the American story. So, to start our journey, we're first going to learn a little bit more about Camp Nelson's formation and how it became the recruiting center for these two units. And for that, I turn to a friend and a colleague and a fantastic Ranger, Ranger Steve.
Thank you, Ernie. I'm standing outside of Fort Jones, one of the massive earthen fortifications constructed by the U.S. Army during the Civil War. Now, Camp Nelson was established in April of 1863 on high ground. To the west will be the Kentucky River. To the east will be Hickman Creek. Federal engineers will establish fortifications to the north and eastern sections of this fortified supply base, which will be a launching off point for federal offensives into East Tennessee. But during the course of the war, this camp will evolve from a supply base and camp of instruction to a recruitment camp as well. It will grow exponentially to about 4,000 acres and consists of over 300 buildings, including workshops, bakeries, warehouses, horse rehabilitation centers, and barracks. Beginning in late 1863 and going into the next year, the Federal armies will start recruiting soldiers. First, white soldiers from Kentucky and East Tennessee, and by 1864, the Federal armies will start recruiting African Americans for service in the U.S. Army. From picks and shovels to muskets and bayonets, African Americans would now join the Union war effort as soldiers. 8 regiments of United States Colored Troops were organized at Camp Nelson, numbering around 10,000 men, including the 114th and 116th United States Colored Troops. To learn more about their recruitment and service, I now turn it over to Ranger Emily.
I'm standing here in front of the barracks building here at Camp Nelson National Monument. This is a symbolic structure, so it was not actually standing when Camp Nelson National Monument was an army depot. However, it's supposed to look like how a building would have looked at that time. Because Kentucky was a border state, the slaves in that state were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. This changed in early 1864 when General Burbridge, commander of the military department of Kentucky, issued General Order 24, which authorized recruitment of black soldiers in Kentucky. Just because the order had been issued did not mean that this was an easy process. The enlistment of black or formerly enslaved men in Kentucky was challenged at every turn because of local enslavers who attempted to exert their influence on the process. 2 of the units formed at Camp Nelson were the 114th and the 116th. The 114th was formed on July 4th of 1864 and was commanded by Colonel Thomas D. Patrick. The 116th was formed soon after, on July 12th of 1864, and was commanded by the 30-year-old Colonel William W. Woodward. Both of these units would eventually become about 1,000 men each, and included Hiram Mosley, who at age 20 enlisted in the 116th. The speed with which the 116th and the 114th were sent to the front reflected how badly they were needed at this point in the war. To get there, both units independently traveled by boat on the Ohio River to West Virginia, where they then traveled by rail to Baltimore, and from Baltimore they traveled by ship through the Chesapeake Bay and then up the James River. Now we'll transition to Ranger Burt at Richmond National Battlefield Park.
Hi, I'm Ranger Burt Dunkerley with Richmond National Battlefield Park. I'm standing at Deep Bottom, which is a boat landing about 10 miles east of Richmond. Behind me is the James River, and I'm standing next to a historic marker. Today, this is a boat landing and a public park. Now, historically, Deep Bottom was an important river crossing for the Union Army. They built a pontoon bridge here and established a supply base and fortified the high ground around it. When the troops from Camp Nelson were sent out, some of them arrived here in Virginia, outside of Richmond. And the fact that the Union Army is even able to raise 10 regiments and send them wherever it wants to speaks volumes about the Union's war capability by this point in the war. The 116th United States Colored Troops will arrive here in September 1864. They don't see any fighting at first. They spend time guarding this river crossing and working on various projects, building fortifications, working on the Dutch Gap Canal, which was part of a Union effort to divert the James River around Confederate battery positions. They're going to be held in reserve for the fighting in the fall of 1864 at places like Darbytown Road, Charles City Road, and Seven Pines. In fact, they don't see much action for a while, and their commander, General William Birney, would write, "They are illiterate freedmen from Kentucky, wholly unsuited for guard duty. They have no discipline and need instruction as soldiers, and they've been kept on fatigue or detached service, unarmed, separated into squads, and have not received instruction as soldiers." But their time would come. Later, in January 1865, the 114th United States Colored Troops would arrive here from Camp Nelson. Both of these units are part of the Army of the James, which was the Union Army operating in this area. And the Army of the James would eventually have 17 regiments of United States Colored Troops. Another site that these troops are going to occupy is Fort Harrison. Welcome to Fort Harrison. This is one of the sites in Richmond National Battlefield Park. And I'm standing in the middle of the fort. Behind me are some mounds. These are earthworks that were dug by the Union Army. This was actually a Confederate fort that Union troops had captured in September 1864. Standing next to a historic marker that shows a photograph taken at this exact spot. Now, the 114th and 116th United States Colored Troops would occupy this fort and some of the earthworks that extend for several miles to the south and to the north. The Union troops dug a whole series of earthworks outside of Richmond. And they spent the winter and spring of 1864 into 1865 garrisoning this fort and some of the other earthworks along this line. The duty was monotonous, but it was also dangerous. This is the front lines. The Confederates are only 1,000 yards away, right behind me. In late March 1865, just 2 miles south of here, President Lincoln came and reviewed some of the troops from the Army of the James. And among the units in that review was the 116th United States Colored Troops. Think about a time when you experienced sudden changes in your life and events moved so fast it made your head spin. Imagine that moment for these soldiers. A year ago, they were runaway slaves in Kentucky. And here they are on the front lines in Virginia being reviewed by the President of the United States. Well, in April, the 114th is going to stay here and be part of the Union advance into Richmond. The 116th is going to be sent south to Petersburg and join the fighting there in March 1865.
Hello, my name is Grant Gates, and on behalf of Petersburg National Battlefield, I would like to welcome you to the Clements Farm. As Ranger Dunkerley said, when the 114th and 116th arrived, they found themselves serving in the trenches near Richmond. They were now part of the siege of Petersburg that had started in June of 1864. The siege lines ran over 25 miles from the Confederate capital south and around and beyond Petersburg. Beginning at sunset on March 27, 1865, the 116th crossed the James and Appomattox rivers on its march south to Petersburg. Less than 2 days later, they were in position about 7 miles south and west of the city, here near the Clements Farm. Behind me, this two-story wooden frame building is the original Clements farmhouse. The 116th spent several days here, a few hundred yards from the Confederate lines to the west and next to the Union 6th Corps to the north of the farm. In that time, the regiment exchanged fire with and were occasionally shelled by the Confederates. Late on April 1st, the Union artillery unleashed a heavy bombardment along the siege lines. Early on the morning of April 2nd, the Union 6th Corps launched a pre-dawn assault and broke through the Confederate lines just north of the Clements Farm. The 116th crossed into the abandoned works in front of them, joining the Union forces that swept up the captured lines towards Petersburg.
This is the interior of the southern-facing wall of Confederate Fort Gregg. In the worn earthen remains, one can still see several of the artillery ramps where cannon were fired against the Union tide on April 2nd. Fort Gregg, and just to the north, Fort Whitworth, were fortifications that guarded the western approach to the city. The forts were over a mile outside the defensive wall of Petersburg, known as the Dimmock Line. Heavily outnumbered, the Confederate defenders at Gregg and Whitworth stalled and then stopped the Union drive toward the city. The men of the 116th only witnessed this battle. When the forts fell, the division the 116th was in marched to the south and east of Fort Gregg to within a few hundred yards of Battery 45 on the Dimmock Line. They were to determine the strength of the enemy in the battery. They were consequently exposed for more than an hour to the fire of 11 pieces of artillery, which was only prevented from being very destructive by the want of skill on the part of the gunners and their firing mostly solid shot, reported an officer of the 114th USCT who were there with the 116th. It was at this point in the fields 1/2 mile to the south and east of Fort Gregg that in the late afternoon of April 2nd, Private Hiram Mosley of Company I was killed by one of those solid shots. The 20-year-old who went from being enslaved to serving in the Union Army, to seeing President Lincoln, had now given his life just days before the war's end. All this within 10 months. The 116th, along with the rest of the division, moved to safety and then encamped for the night. By 5:30 on the morning of April 3rd, the 116th passed through the abandoned Confederate works and witnessed the end of nearly 10 months of fighting around Petersburg and Richmond. As the black regiments entered the streets of Petersburg, the chaplain of the 127th USCT observed that their approach was hailed with joy by all the black population. They came out into the streets and filled doors and windows with eager faces. The soldiers partook of the spirit of the occasion and marched well through the city. Some recognized acquaintances who marched along and visited as they went. Others burst out in singing song, of which "Babylon is fallen" and "I'm going to occupy the land" was the chorus. The only black soldiers' published account of this moment stated, "We were among the first troops to enter Petersburg, and the orderly, well-behaved disposition of our command elicited the praise of our officers and the universal commendations of the people, sobriety and decorum being the order of the day." This is some of what the men of the 116th may have experienced as they marched through the siege-worn streets of Petersburg. This along with the not so warm reception from many white citizens of the city. Their stay was short-lived, as within 3 hours of their arrival, new orders were given. In under a week's time, this regiment had stood in review for President Lincoln and helped to capture Petersburg and Richmond. By 7:30 on the morning of April 3rd, they were already marching west in pursuit of General Lee's army amid talk about the war's end.
My name is Chris Bingham. I'm a park ranger here at Appomattox Courthouse, National Historical Park. Behind me is part of the battlefield of April 9th of 1865, the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse, that helped trap Lee's army and lead to his surrender that afternoon. The open fields behind me, bordered by dense woods. You might also see in the far distance modern Virginia Highway 24, approximately in the same location as the Richmond-Lynchburg Stage Road, which will figure into our story. Now, we last left you at Petersburg National Battlefield, talking about the 116th U.S. Colored Infantry, their role in the capture of Petersburg. And starting on April 3rd, General Ulysses S. Grant is going to begin the pursuit of Lee's army to the west. Now, it is Grant's goal not just to follow in Lee's footsteps, but to cut him off, to cut off the Confederate route south to North Carolina. The 2nd Division of the 25th Corps, including the 116th USCT, will participate in this campaign. Initially, they are well south of the Confederate columns, marching along the South Side Railroad as they head west. Their mission is to secure that railroad as a potential future supply line for Grant's armies. They're part of Colonel William Woodward's brigade, alongside the 29th and 31st U.S. Colored Infantry. And now, Colonel Woodward was the former commander of the 116th. He was very familiar with those soldiers, and they with him. Their role in this campaign will start to change on April 7th, 1865, in the vicinity of Farmville. From Farmville, Grant will split his forces, attempting to kind of launch a pincer move on Lee's army to cut him off and surround him in the vicinity of Appomattox Station and Appomattox Courthouse. From this point on, the 116th and really the entire Army of the James, commanded by General Edward Ord, will participate in one of the epic forced marches of the entire American Civil War. From Farmville all the way to Appomattox Station, a distance of 30 miles, they will conduct that march in about 20 hours' time. General Ord kind of firing up his soldiers, explaining that their legs are going to win the war if they can get in front of Lee's army. Sergeant Major William McCausland of the 29th U.S. Colored Infantry, in the same brigade as the 116th, described the march as rapid and devious, while one of the surgeons with the 25th Corps, named C.P. Heikold, described that in 3 years of experience, he had never witnessed greater powers of endurance than during this campaign, that there was no straggling and the men were often in the best of spirits. Now, these soldiers will arrive near Appomattox Station in the early morning hours of April 9th, get a few hours of rest, and just after dawn on April 9th, they begin hearing the battle that is raging here in this area, closer to the village of Appomattox Courthouse. There are Federal cavalry blocking this Richmond-Lynchburg stage road, trying to hem in Lee's army, and the Confederates are attacking them, driving them back down the road, trying to reopen that escape route. The infantry of the Army of the James, these white and black soldiers, will march to their relief as quickly as they can. This open field behind me would quickly fill with more and more Federal soldiers. One North Carolinian, stationed just behind the camera on this ridge, looking out across that field, described this Federal attack as looking like a blue checkerboard, with the white and black soldiers advancing together. Colonel William Woodward described his brigade's movement as rapid, as pushing back the Confederate skirmishers back on their main line, and after advancing roughly 1 mile, they halt within sight of the village of Appomattox Courthouse. And just at that moment, Confederate white flags begin to come out. Now, this battle, in which the 116th have suffered no casualties, miraculously, proves decisive. Lee's escape route is blocked, his army is trapped, and he will surrender that afternoon. This decisive Federal victory was brought in part by the participation of the 116th being in the right place at the right time to block this road. Now, April 9th, 1865, is Freedom Day in Virginia. Emancipation in this area in southern and central Virginia is only enforced with the surrender of Lee's army, with his defeat. These formerly enslaved sons of Kentucky, serving the 116th, are now acting as agents of emancipation to bring that reality to the majority of the population right here in Appomattox County, enslaved men, women, and children, and throughout central and south side Virginia. Now, about 2 days later, on the 11th of April, they return back to Petersburg. They're in Garrison there for a few weeks and up toward Richmond as well. And then in late May of 1865, the entire 25th Corps receives orders that transfer them to Texas, to garrison duty along the Rio Grande and the border with Mexico, much to the chagrin of these USCT themselves, who figured their service was going to come to an end. Honestly, this was done to placate white Virginians, former Confederates, who refused to accept African American soldiers as a legitimate occupation force. Their transfer to Texas means that the participation of the 116th, their service on behalf of the Union and of emancipation, will continue.
Welcome back to Camp Nelson. I'm standing in open green fields near the northern fortification line of Camp Nelson, next to an obelisk that stands about 10 feet tall and was constructed in the memory of the women, men, children, soldiers, civilians, and refugees who all called Camp Nelson home at some time from 1863 to 1866. Many of the people that died while working and living at Camp Nelson included men who were USCTs, but also white soldiers from East Tennessee and family members of all of these soldiers, white and black, and they were buried here in what would become known as Graveyard Number 1. The federal government would order the dismantling of Camp Nelson in 1866. This dismantling would prompt 217 soldiers that had been buried here at Graveyard Number 1 to be reinterred to the southern part of the camp, today known as Camp Nelson National Cemetery. At Camp Nelson National Cemetery, there are 71 soldiers that had served in the 114th and 116th USCT during the war, in addition to many other soldiers that perished along the way, like Hiram Mosley on April 2nd near Petersburg. Many of the wives and children of the soldiers in the 114th and 116th waited for the return of the soldiers while living in the Home for Colored Refugees located in the western part of the camp. Today, on the other side of Highway 27, 7 acres are managed by the National Park Service there, which includes the Fee Memorial Church on the grounds of the Home for Colored Refugees. Once soldiers returned, many of the soldiers and their families would not stay in this area. Many would seek opportunities in Ohio, including exodusters to Kansas and many other places. However, some would stay. And as land returned back to private ownership, the town of Ariel formed and became home to former soldiers and their families seeking opportunities after the Civil War. Even today, there are descendants of those families living in what is now known as the community of Hull. We want to thank you for joining us on this journey as we've explored the war experiences with the 114th and the 116th USCT, and also our friends and colleagues at Richmond, Petersburg, Appomattox Courthouse, and here at Camp Nelson National Monument. We invite everyone to come out to not only these 4 National Park Service units, but parks all over the country to help us understand on a deeper level the meanings of the American Civil War. And we also understand that the legacy of that Civil War is still being shaped even to this day. We hope to see you out at the park sometime soon. Thanks.